All right, so now that we know some of the basics of Blender, we can get started actually making our art assets for our project. Now, as I said in a previous video, in this course, I'm really only going to be covering the tools and functionality that is required to make these pieces. If you are interested in learning more about Blender and all of its functionalities, because it has a lot of functionality, I do recommend you taking the Blender Mega course, at least the Blender Basics portion of it, if you're not very familiar with Blender or the concepts behind 3D modeling. So that being said, let's move forward. And what we are going to be making today is we're going to start on our tile sets. Tile sets in game development are the pieces of mesh that need to snap together in a seamless way. So things like our walls and our floor and our ceilings will all be tiling. So because they're right next to each other, we need to create them in such a way that there's no seams or gaps in the wall piece itself. So that is what we are going to be covering today. We're going to be making our 4-meter wall piece. So the first step for making this is, here I have just a new general Blender file here. And the first thing I'm going to do is just select everything in the scene and press delete to delete it all. Because we're not going to be using a cube for this, what we are going to be using is a mesh plane. So let's press Shift and A and add a new mesh plane into the scene. Now, if you recall, our wall pieces were all 4 meters by 4 meters. Those were the dimensions we set. And by default, Blender adds in new mesh primitives at a dimension of 2 meters typically. So these grid lines here each represent 1 meter. So this plane is a 2 by 2 plane. So the first thing I want to do is scale this up. However, I'm not going to scale this to 4 meters as you may expect. I am actually going to scale it to 8 meters. And I'll explain why in just a moment, but first let's scale this properly. So what I'm going to do is, in object mode, I'm going to select my plane here. I'm going to press S and 4 to scale this up by a factor of 4, because 2 times 4 is of course 8. And you can see here along these edges, we have a plane of 8 meters by 8 meters. Now, you may be wondering why I'm doubling the size, and that is because the method we are going to use to create this wall texture is going to require us to use tiling in order for things to appear seamlessly and our final result without any weird hitches or gaps. We need to use a tiling method. So we're going to scale this to twice the size that it needs to be, and we're going to create our wall mesh on it. But eventually we are going to bake it down to a 4 by 4 meter wall segment. And having a little extra room when you're working with tiling can help you achieve a better result. So here we have our 8 meter by 8 meter wall piece. And the first thing we need to do is we need to add a bit more geometry to it, because if we were to tab into edit mode right now, you can see that this wall piece consists of a single face, which we are not going to be really able to add any detail to this until it has more points to work with. So the way that we're going to go about that is by using a subdivision surface modifier. Now, subdivision is the process of dividing faces evenly into smaller faces. So if I were to subdivide this in a normal way, I could, in edit mode, select this face, right click and hit subdivide. And we discussed this earlier in the course. However, we are not going to be doing it via regular mesh modeling. We are going to be using a subdivision surface modifier because this speeds up the process just a little bit. So in the properties panel on the right here, click on this wrench icon to bring up the modifiers panel. So modifiers are automatic operations that affect an object's geometry in a non-destructive way. With modifiers, you can perform many effects automatically that would otherwise be too tedious to do manually, and also it will not affect the base geometry of your object. So to add a subdivision surface modifier to this mesh here, all we have to do is click Add Modifier and select Subdivision Surface, and you can immediately see what this has done. It has subdivided our mesh, but it has also smoothed it out. So we get sort of this more circular form right here. And that is because this option right here, this Catmull-Clark, is describing the subdivision algorithm it is using. It is dividing it and then smoothing it. If we wanted to divide without smoothing, which in this case we do, what we want to do is come over here and click Simple. Now this will return our plane to its original form, but we do have some subdivision information underneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and click the levels of subdivision up to, let's say, 4. So what this has done here is this essentially tells us how many times to perform the subdivision operation. So when I right-clicked and pressed subdivide directly into the mesh, that was subdividing the mesh 1 time by creating a line here and a line here. So the subdivision surface modifier has just allowed me to do that 4 times very quickly. If I were to tab into edit mode, you would see that I still have a singular face here. And that is because, of course, I am working with a modifier, which is a non-destructive method for mesh editing. However, we are going to need to be able to edit some of these points directly. So the way that we bake this information into our mesh is by applying the modifier. So to apply the modifier, let's come over here to the modifier in the modifier stack and click on this little drop down arrow, and you'll see an option here which says apply. Now, if when you click down and this is grayed out and you cannot apply it, this is because you are still in edit mode. Modifiers can only be applied to objects while they are in object mode. So if this is the case, just press tab to return to object mode and you should be able to apply the modifier. So what has this done? If we tab into edit mode now, we can see all the points and the subdivisions that it has created here. And now we can work with these points on an individual level, which is really great for adding detail to your model. So this has given us a really good starting point. So what I actually want to create for this wall piece is sort of just a generic stone wall texture. So I think the best way to go about creating this is actually by using our sculpting mode. So to enter sculpting mode, all we have to do is select the object that we wish to sculpt on, and from the mode drop-down list, we're going to choose sculpt mode. Now, sculpting in 3D modeling. Now, sculpting within the world of 3D art is similar to modeling in that it is a method of maneuvering these points on our plane around. However, this is just done in a more artistic way than modeling, which is a little bit more mathematical. So when you go to sculpt on your piece, if I just click and draw right now, you can see that underneath my brush here, I have pushed all these vertices up. So let's just Control Z to undo that, because that's not actually what we want to do. So over on the left here, we have our tool panel of all of our different sculpting brushes. So I can pull these out to view all their names here. And there's lots of different brushes that we can use to sculpt on this surface. And these are all meant to replicate the process of sculpting in clay. So you can think of our plane here as just a flat piece of clay that we want to sculpt on. We'll talk more in depth about sculpting when we talk about prop creation, but for now, just know that it is a system of allowing us to move our vertices around by basically drawing directly onto our mesh. So when I click and drag using the draw brush here, you can see that it's moving all these points upwards and, deforming them from the surface of our plane. But these are quite faceted and jagged, and we really don't have enough geometry to work with here to create anything visually legible. So what we need to do is we need to increase the number of points, the number of subdivisions on this plane even further. Now, the problem with this is that increasing subdivisions to the level that is generally required for sculpting is very performance heavy and will cause your machine to slow down a lot. So Blender has cleverly come up with some ways to use a high number of polygons in a more performant way. So I'm just going to press Ctrl Z to undo those marks I made. And I'm going to come back over here to the modifier stack because we need a new modifier in order to get the density that we need to do this sculpt. So in the modifier stack, I'm just going to add a modifier, and this time I'm going to choose multi-resolution. Now, what this has done immediately is nothing because we have no levels of subdivision. So this is another modifier that we're going to use for subdivision, but this one is made specifically to work in sculpt mode. So what the multi-res allows us to do is we can press subdivide here. And you can see that we've already started rounding out these corners because we're increasing the levels of subdivision here each time we press this button. So now if I subdivide this, let's say 3 times and come in here and sculpt, you can see using the same draw brush with the same settings, I get a much smoother result. And this is going to allow us to draw in the details that we need. However, because we are creating tile sets, these rounded corners are going to be an issue. So I'm just going to hit Ctrl Z to undo it because it's very important when creating tiling textures and tiling meshes that they be able to snap together perfectly in all 4 directions. So if I were to duplicate this mesh out in the Y direction here and in the X direction, there should be no gaps. So I've just undone my subdivisions here, and instead of clicking subdivide, in order to keep these edges tight, I'm just going to hit the simple subdivision. And let's go up to, I think, 3 or 4, but I'm going to check the number of polygons that I have here by coming up to my overlays drop down and enabling statistics. So I will get this little readout in the corner that tells me how many vertices and faces I'm currently working with. You can also tell if your mesh is dense enough just by making a stroke and checking on the quality of it here. So this is still a bit low. I'm going to Ctrl Z to undo it. Let's do a simple subdivision up to, yes, let's start with this 262 or roughly there. So as you can see, when I draw on this, this is much smoother than the result I was getting before. However, the really nice thing about the multi-res is that at any point, if I needed to make a larger stroke, I could de-res my subdivisions by coming into this modifier here and clicking down. And you can see that the subdivisions are dynamically de-resing. But what's really cool about this is that I can then make strokes at my lower subdivision level. And when I return to my higher one, the stroke will still be there and it will be smoothed out. So this is really good for dynamic sculpting because it helps you get the forms you need and at the level of detail that you need them. So I'm just going to Ctrl Z to undo those strokes because for this we want to create, of course, a tiling brick or stone-like texture. So the first thing I'm going to do is press 7 to come into top orthographic view because I want to be viewing this straight down. The next thing I'm going to do here is come into my active tool and workspace settings. Here we have lots of settings for whatever brush you currently have selected. So if I select a different brush here from the toolbar, you can see my settings over here change. Now, the setting that I specifically want to look at for this is underneath the symmetry option. We'll talk more about sculpting with symmetry when we talk about props, but in this particular case, I want to look at the lock and the tiling options. So the lock option here will prevent movement in any direction that you select here. So in this case, I want to lock the X and the Y because I don't want my points to move this way or this way. I want them only to move up and down away from the plane. And the second option here, and more importantly, is the tiling. This is what is going to allow us to create a piece that tiles seamlessly when it is when there is an array of them next to each other. So I'm just going to press 7 to return to orthographic view here, and I'm just going to pull these in. Actually, I'm just seeing that my keystroke capture is sort of hard to see here, so let me just fix that really quick. Okay, so there we go. That's a little better, and now you can see the names of the brushes as I am using them as well. Okay, so we want this piece to be a 4-way tile piece, which means that I can tile it in this direction or in this direction, and there will be no seams or gaps. So keep in mind that the red line in Blender is for the X direction and the green is for Y, so we want to tile in both the X and the Y directions. So now I need to go about sculpting in the actual stones or bricks that are going to make up my texture. And the way I've chosen to do this is by using the crease brush right here. Now, as the name implies, when you draw with the crease brush over your mesh, it will push down and pinch in the line. So let's zoom in here. So the crease will sort of create an indentation like that, as opposed to the draw brush, which was pushing upwards. So this is what I want for this. And I lost a level of subdivision somewhere when I undid. But you can also see when I draw on this with the crease brush how this tiling feature works. Instead of just drawing underneath my singular stroke, it is going to tile it in all directions. So you can see here on the edge, it has split my stroke along the edge here in such a way that if I were to tile this, and in fact, let me just quickly pop into object mode to show you that. Oh, also, if you are using the multi-res and you come into object mode and all your detail disappears, you didn't lose your work. Don't worry. It's just because this setting for level viewport is still set to 0. So set it up to 5 and your strokes will be there again. So I'm going to show you how this tiles by just adding a quick modifier of an array here. So what an array modifier does is it basically just simply duplicates your mesh, your object, in whatever direction to whatever dimensions you set here. So I have a count of 2, it's duplicated it once, so we have a total of 2 of these, and it's duplicated it one time, one of its own length across the X. So you could increase the count any number of times and it would still tile in this direction. Additionally, if we create another array modifier here, set the X factor to 0, set the Y factor to 1, we can see here that this is tiling seamlessly in all directions because of course our actual mesh stops here, but via the use of a modifier we can duplicate it any number of times and there is no gaps here where our stroke was. So that is sort of the basis for what we are going to do here. Let's see if I can Control Z to get out of this. Okay. So I just Control Z to get back to our basic plane here with no strokes on it and a subdivision level of 5. So with all that in mind, we can now basically just draw what we want our walls to look like on here. But because we are working in 3D and not 2D, instead of drawing a flat image, of course it is going to push and pull our vertices up and down to create a 3D effect. So I'm going to just press 7 to return to orthographic mode. And I'm going to take my crease brush with a relatively small size. You can incrementally increase the size and decrease the size with the bracket keys here, or you can press F and use your mouse to select the size that you wish. So I'm going to go pretty small here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to the edge. I'm going to click while holding, actually, before I start to draw on this, there is one more setting I need to change. So in the active tool panel here in the properties panel, I need to change my stroke method because right now it's just a freehand stroke underneath my cursor, but I want to be able to create straight lines to create the gaps in between our bricks. So to do that, I'm going to, within the crease brush itself, I'm going to come down here to where it says stroke. And here it says stroke method is space. We're going to change that to line. So now when I click and drag out, I get a line, and when I release, that line is drawn in. Okay, so now we are ready to actually start. I'm going to turn the strength of this up to 1. So you can change the strength of your brush right here. It is the same setting that is right here in the sidebar as well. So I'm just going to click, and then I'm going to press Alt to lock the rotation to a 45 angle so it will snap. And I'm going to come across here, and I'm just going to release, and it will create sort of this perfect indented line here that you can see. If we look at it in profile, it has pushed these vertices in. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the grid lines as my rough estimate for where to place these. I'm just going to continue this up until we have horizontal lines across the entire mesh. Oops. So you have to click first and then press Alt, which is a little bit tricky when you're selecting close to the edge. And if you get these little sort of hitches in this, don't worry too much about this because we don't want our stones to be completely perfect. That would look very strange. So we're gonna add some like roughness and damage to these afterwards. So don't worry too much about slight imperfections like that. And because this is tiling, you don't actually have to pull your stroke across your entire mesh. If you'd like to zoom in, you just have to pull it over the lines here, the y-axis and the x-axis line. So this is a pretty good basis for our stone tiling texture. How large you want these stones is entirely up to you. So if you wanted the stones to tile a little bit smaller, you could just go in and add more of these in between the ones that we've just added. And like these aren't completely perfectly even. I think that's going to be okay in this case. I think it'll still, you don't want everything to be completely uniform because that's just not natural looking. But when creating tiling meshes, you definitely want to avoid any like large form features that are going to be noticed when this is repeated across many, many, you know, wall pieces that are all stacked right next to each other. Okay, so we have our horizontal lines, and now all I'm going to do is, using the exact same method, I'm just going to add some vertical lines across this space. So I'm just going to zoom into this upper quadrant because this is what makes up like a single tile. Again, I don't want these to be perfectly uniform because it's just not the look that I'm going for. But if you did want them to be perfect, you could definitely use the grid to achieve that. So I'm just trying to get some variation in like the sizes and the widths of these. And I'm just pressing Alt to make sure that I'm snapping exactly aligned with the world. And again, here I overshot my creases a little bit. I'm not especially concerned about that because I think I'll just incorporate that in as part of the natural like damage and roughness of the bricks. Make one that's like a little bit more square in here. Maybe that one's a little bit longer. I think this one's a little bit too long, so let's just divide that one up. So you'll get something roughly like this. And when you zoom out, you can see that to the eye, of course, if you really sat there and looked, you could see the repeating elements, but to the eye, it's just going to read this as a brick wall. So that is going to be like the basis for this, but now we're just going to come in and add a little bit of detail. So what we're going to do is I'm going to come back to my modifier stack and I'm going to up-res it one more time, just so we have about 1,000,000 points here to work with. I generally find that for like a mid-range PC, which is what I'm working on here, 1,000,000 points when you're sculpting generally gives you the amount of detail that you need without crashing your computer, which is definitely a possibility. So also make sure that you save a lot. Let's call this wall tile. Because when sculpting, when working with really high poly counts here, it can potentially crash your PC if you have a lower end PC. So definitely make sure you save a lot. Okay, so I want to add some like damage and some roughness to these because they're far too square and far too uniform. So I found that the scrape brush works really well in this particular case, but you can definitely experiment with any and all of these brushes, and I encourage you to do that. But I'm going to use the scrape brush right here. I'm going to increase my size a bit, not too much because I don't want too much damage going across these bricks. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come in and just start lightly tapping to rough up the edges especially. So fortunately, because we are still using the tiling in our sculpt here, when I basically only have to do one quadrant of this, and all of this will carry over to the other quadrant. So you can think of it as doing like a quarter of the work. So I am using a Wacom drawing tablet for this. This isn't necessary for sculpting, but it does make it a lot easier because you're using more of a natural drawing stroke with the pen, and you can use the pressure of the pen to determine the things like the strength here and even the size if I click this. So if you do have a drawing tablet, that may help you with this. It may speed things up. It's not strictly necessary. However, everything I'm doing can be accomplished with a mouse and keyboard. You just might have to come in and manually set things like the size and the strength a little bit more often than I am doing. So there's not any special technique here. I just have my scrape brush at a decently high strength, and all I'm doing is coming around and just giving the edges a once over and not being too careful with it, because of course what I'm trying to accomplish is adding some natural variation and damage to it. And I'm also trying to vary the amount of damage that I add to each of these bricks. So like for some of these, I'm coming into the brick itself more, and some of these I'm sticking closer to the edge. You just kind of have to get a feel for it and eyeball it and just kind of work with the mesh. So like I said, here is where I overshot my crease a little bit. I'm just going to work that in as part of the damage. You want to avoid too many things like this because they'll start to be noticeable when you start to tile them. So you kind of want any sort of damage or detailing that you add over your meshes. If they're tiling, you want to add them in sort of a uniform way so that when you zoom out, there's no large spots that stand out to the eye. I'm going to increase the strength of my brush to 1 here just to speed this up a little bit. Okay, so you can obviously spend a lot of time on this, but I think that is sufficient for our purposes. I'm not quite done sculpting this, as I've added some nice chunky damage to all the corners, but the surfaces of these are much too smooth. So there's lots of different ways that you could go about adding some surface variation to this. I think the way I'm going to do it is by using a texture alpha. So I'm going to pause the recording, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how to add a little bit more surface detail to our wall piece. Okay, so we're back. We have the basis for our wall mesh right here. We're still in sculpting mode, and now I want to add some variation to the surface of these bricks so that they match the weathering that I've given the edges here. So the way that I'm going to go about this is by using an alpha texture to get finer detail than I really would be able to by hand with just these default brushes. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, an alpha is simply a black and white image, such as this one here, that is in most digital art, it is used to represent the opacity of an image, with the black areas meaning fully transparent and the white areas meaning fully opaque. Now, alphas can be used by Blender to interpolate our sculpting strokes in a similar way here, where any area that is black is not going to be transformed at all, and any areas that are white are going to be fully transformed to the full extent of your brush strength. So let's see how we go about adding a alpha texture to our brushes here. So I'm going to do this based off of the draw brush. The draw is sort of a default brush in Blender. It just sort of pushes the verts up away from the mesh in a single direction. And it just sort of is the most basic brush that we have. So I'm going to do this based off of the draw brush. And the first thing I want to do is to duplicate it so that I don't overwrite any of my default settings. And you can see when I've duplicated it here, it's given it a suffix because it needs a unique name, but we can rename it. Let's name it texture brush. Okay, so once we have that here, we're going to come down to the texture tab right here, and we get this sort of blank icon here. Let's press new, and that will give us sort of this flat black here, which has basically a value of 0 across the board for the texture. So to load in an alpha texture, all we have to do is come to our texture tab down at the bottom, this icon right here, and here we have our little file browser, which we should be familiar with. I'm going to click open, and I'm going to navigate to this area on my desktop where I have saved several alphas. Now, you'll have to source your alphas yourself, but there are some good resources out there on the internet. One I personally like to use is the Pixelogic Resource Center. So you can just Google Pixelogic Resource Center. You'll get this here. Pixelogic are the makers of ZBrush, which is a standalone sculpting application that's more on the professional level. So don't worry about getting ZBrush or anything at this point, but from this page here, this download center page, we can go to this tab here that says alphas. And they have a small but really good library of different types of alpha images that you can download for free and use however you like. I think I'm using this one right here for this project, this KD Rock Surface 09. But go ahead and peruse that and take any alphas that you think would work and are good. I already have them downloaded, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to come in here to where I saved them on my hard drive, and yep, there we have the KD Rock 09. So I'm just going to click open image, and we'll get this image right here in the preview. Now, there's a couple more things we have to tweak here. First, and you'll see the previews right here as well. When we sculpt right now, we're getting this sort of tiled blobbiness with these big blank spaces in between, which is not what we want at all. So to fix that, we just have to come in here, and this is under the active tool settings, under texture, where it says mapping. We want to change tiled to area plane. So this is going to give us more of a normal stroke that we're familiar with under our brush. The next thing I want to change is the spacing, because you'll see when I go to sculpt over this, you're getting some strange tiling effects because the spacing of the image is too close together. So to fix that, we're going to come into the stroke menu here, and we're going to leave it at space, but we're just going to increase the spacing from 10% to 25, I think is pretty good, and that gives us a better spacing. And you can tweak this to your specific needs. Obviously, a higher percent will give you more spacing between. So I think that 25 is about right for me. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to come in and I'm going to draw over with this texture now in my brush. I'm going to set my strength a little bit lower, let's say 0.3 maybe. And this may take some trial and error. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hold control while I make these strokes, because right now, when we make these strokes, they are pushing our surface up, and I actually want to push the points down. So if I hold control and make the stroke, you can see it's indenting into the bricks rather than lifting them off. So holding control and coming in here, I'm just going to start lightly tapping with my pen here and pulling out some strokes just to get some weathering and detail on the surface of these. And how much weathering and damage is largely up to you. It's really aesthetic and whatever your needs for the project are. So I want to just make sure that I'm distributing this damage more or less uniformly across the entire surface of my mesh here, because as I said in a previous video, if you have any sort of large forms that are distinguishable from a distance, it's going to look strange when you go to tile. Oops. Okay. So you can spend a lot of time getting this just the way you like it. And if I were in a production setting, I would probably spend a little bit longer on these edges here to get them a little bit, well, not cleaner, but a little bit nicer looking anyway. But I think for the purposes of this video, this is sufficient. I think you get the idea here. So once we have our sculpt complete, we are ready to move out of sculpting mode. So I'm going to come back into object mode, and of course my sculpt disappears because I do have my level viewport set to 0. Let's set that back to 6 just so we can see everything that we've done here. So once you have your sculpted piece complete, we need to bake this information down onto a flat image plane, because in its current state, this piece is not really optimized for game performance. In game engines, they run everything at real time. So bringing in something that has, 2 million triangles in it will slow down the performance of your PC. Now, this is mitigated somewhat by Unreal Engine 5's new nanite system, but I still think it is better to learn the proper way to optimize your meshes for game engines, even with some new technologies coming out that make it, more feasible to bring in dense meshes like this. Okay, so what we need to do here, I'm going to come up and I'm just going to rename these so I don't get confused. Let's call this sculpt plane. Okay, so we are in object mode here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift A and add a new plane to my scene here. Now, I want this to bake down to the final proper size so that everything tiles correctly. So basically, I want this plane to be half the size of this one, because if you recall, when we started this sculpting bit, we made this twice the size as our final output result. So with the new plane selected, I'm just going to hit S and 2 to scale that up so that it is exactly half of the size of the one underneath it. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to bake what is called a normal map. And a normal map is essentially a special type of channel-packed image that will allow us to transfer this detail onto this much less complicated, less performance-heavy plane. So to bake a normal map here, we're first going to come into our render properties. And by default, as long as you're using a up-to-date version of Blender, your render engine is going to be Eevee. Now, Eevee is the name of Blender's real-time rendering engine. So it's basically more or less operating in the same way that one does for Unreal. However, there are some limitations to Eevee, including it doesn't allow us to bake maps directly into Blender. So in order to bake a map in Blender, we have to change this from Eevee to cycles. Nothing should change in your viewport so far. There are a couple things that you do want to look at before we start baking though. Here, our device is set to CPU. This is just not super performant. Since I am working on a desktop that has a dedicated graphics card, I want to be using my GPU for that. The other GPU related setting you want to look at is if we come up to Edit, Preferences, System, we want to look at this right here. This is our cycles rendered devices. So because we are using the cycles engine, which is Blender's ray tracing engine, we want to make sure that this is set up properly. So here you'll see that this is the graphics card I am using in my PC, and that is what is selected. So we do not want to be using our CPU. If you have a dedicated graphics card, definitely use that. And then this by default will probably be set to none. So you want to select one of these options here instead. And which one you need to select depends on your graphics card. Basically, the way I understand it is that if you have an NVIDIA, you want to be using either the CUDA or the OptiX. Now, OptiX is newer and faster, so if you have a relatively new NVIDIA card, use OptiX. If you have an older NVIDIA card, you want to use the CUDA. And then if you have an AMD card, you want to use the HIP. So I'm going to choose OptiX for this, and you can just press X to cancel that out. The next thing that we need to do is we need to come down here where it says Bake. And this is under the render properties for your properties panel. Let's go ahead and expand this Bake. option here. Now this is going to give us all the options we need to bake our normal map, but there's a few things that we need to do before we can just hit bake and have it work out. So the first thing we need to do is to bake a normal map into an image. We need to have an image for it to bake into, if that makes sense. So we need to set up a material for that will contain the image. So I'm going to come over here to the shading workspace, and I'm going to just collapse that file browser because I don't need it at the moment. So on the plane, not the sculpt plane, the 4 meter plane, we need to add a new material to it. Now, if you're unfamiliar with materials, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but basically a material is what controls the surface properties of your mesh here. So up until now, everything we have looked at has just been this flat gray color. The way you would add color and surface information to your mesh is via a material. Let me just hide this for now. So to add a new material to your object, just select it in the viewport, come to the Material Properties tab, and we're just going to hit New. It's going to create a default blank material. And if we wanted to visualize how this material looked in the viewport, we would just need to change our viewport shading to Material Preview, which is this little thing right here. The icon is the same as this one right here. So this is how Blender adds in default materials. It's like a blank 0.8 white, I believe. So a material consists of many individual properties, which are displayed right here in our node editor. We have properties such as base color, roughness, metallic, and so on. I'm not going to go into great detail on these because I think as we continue to work, it will become more clear. So let's continue to move forward. So as I said, a normal map is a special type of image that allows us to basically instruct our program, be it Blender or Unreal Engine, the way that we want light to interact with this surface. So because it is an image, a 2D image, we need to add a 2D image to our material here in order for us to have a slot, so to speak, to put our normal map in. So I'm going to add a new image. I'm going to come over here to this little window right here, which is our image editor. I'm just going to hit New. Here we can give this a name. Let's call it normal, and a size. What resolution you choose is largely up to you. I like to bake at a pretty high resolution because it's very easy to de-res textures if you don't need that much. If they're taking up too much memory or you don't need that much detail, it's very easy to de-res them, but it's very hard to up-res a low-resolution image. For any of you that have tried to increase the size of an image you've downloaded or something and it gets blurry and pixelated, you'll know exactly what I mean by that. So, so just give it a name and a size and hit OK, and we will be met with this blank black image. So this basically has created a blank image for us, and now we are going to bake our normal map into this image slot. So in order to do that, we need to actually add this image we've created to our material because we've created it within Blender, but it's just sort of floating in space. It's not assigned to any particular material. So to do that, we're going to come into this node editor for our material here. And we're going to hit Shift and A to add something. We're going to choose texture, image texture. That'll give us this box right here with our familiar little image browser icons right here. So now we just need to select which image we want here, which of course is our normal, our blank black normal that we just created. I'm going to change the color space from sRGB to raw. This is specific to normal maps. If you have a normal map with the color space sRGB, it just will not appear correctly in Blender. So you can change it to either non-color or raw. I have not found any substantial difference between those two options. Okay, so we have our image set up and ready to go here. So I'm gonna come back into my render properties and back to the bake tab. Now here we need to tell it what we are baking. So the first thing we need to do is we need to change the baked type from combined to normal, because we want a normal map, of course. The next thing we need to do is tell it to bake our selected object to our active object. So when you have multiple objects in the scene, you need to specify to Blender what you are trying to bake. So what we are going to do is we're going to select our sculpted plane, our high res, our 8-meter plane, and then we are going to shift select and select our new plane so that we still have this plane selected and it will turn a dark orange, but our active object will be whatever we selected last. So because these are right on top of each other, Blender is having a hard time selecting them. So an alternative way to do a multi-select here is to select first our sculpted plane in our outliner and then hold Control and select our image plane here. Now the order in which you select these is very, very important because this setting right here is selected to active. So if you selected them in the wrong order, Blender would be trying to take the detail from your smaller plane and baking them onto your larger plane, which is not what we want. So just make sure that your larger sculpted plane is selected first, and then you select the smaller plane. Okay, so all that being said, let's just come in here and hit bake and see what happens. You'll get a little progress bar down here, and depending on the quality of your machine and the size of your normal here, this may take, several minutes. So let's just give this a minute and we will come back when it is baked. Okay, so here we have our baked normal map in our corner here as a preview. It took a couple minutes on my machine, so be patient if it's taking a little bit longer. But this image here is our normal map. So it's kind of this wacky purple color because it is channel packed. So essentially what a normal map does is it tells the renderer program, which in this case is Blender, but will for us eventually be Unreal. It tells the rendering program how this image, whatever we apply this image to, it tells it how to interact with light. So let me just show you how that works by applying this normal map to our 4-meter plane here. Okay, so the way that we do that is I'm gonna move this down here, and you'll see that in our shader node here, which is basically the thing that takes in all sorts of different pieces of information and compiles it into our material. Now, we're a little bit familiar with node systems already from our blueprint scripting, so this should be a little bit familiar, at least visually to you. But this, of course, is applying nodes as a material setup instead of a code setup, but the principle of how nodes work are basically the same. You read them from left to right. So we're going to take our normal image here, which is represented by this node, and we want to connect it to the normal input on our shader. However, just like in Unreal, the colors here for the nodes do matter, and they indicate the type of input that this piece can accept. So we need to convert this from yellow color to this purple normal here. So the way we're going to do that is with a normal map node. So we're just going to press Shift and A to bring up our add menu. We're going to come under vector here and select normal map here. So this is our converter node. We're just going to plug color to color and normal to normal. And instantly in the viewport, you will see that here we have our sculpted detail here, but it is on a flat singular plane. So at this point, I would like to check to make sure that this is tiling correctly, and I'm going to do that using the array modifier, just as I did before. So I don't need all this information right here, so I'm just going to come back to layout, and I'm going to change my viewport shading to material preview to visualize my normal map. And what I'm going to do now is come in here, add an array modifier, and the default setting works in this case, so I'm just going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to change on the duplicate, I'm going to change the X factor to 0 and the Y factor to 1. And we can see here that it is tiling seamlessly, and we don't have any very noticeable strangeness on the edges of our mesh here. And you can also see when I come in at sort of this glancing angle that the normal map is doing more than just adding our lines in as color. The light is interacting with this surface as if these details were sculpted in, which is the entire purpose of a normal map. Okay, so we don't actually need these arrays. That was just for checking to make sure everything was okay. The other way you can check your tiling is within your image editor itself. If you press N, you'll bring up this side panel here. And if we select the View tab, we can select this Repeat Image, which will tile your image infinitely. And you can always check your tiling that way. So this all looks pretty good. So we're going to take a quick break here. And when we come back, we are going to finish up this piece by adding some color and other properties to the surface of it to get our final look. So that is in the next video, and I will see you then. All right, so when we last left off, we had just created our normal map. Now, we're gonna get into further developing the surface appearance of this. And the first step I wanna take to that effect is by baking one more type of map called ambient occlusion. So just as the normal map tells Blender, hey, this is how light should react with our surface, and ambient occlusion tells us where we should draw in our shadows. And it just adds a little bit more depth to our pieces. So we're going to use a pretty similar baking process here to achieve an ambient occlusion effect. So the first thing we need to do here is to add a texture slot to bake our ambient occlusion into. And also, I think when I left off this last video, I forgot to mention that you do in fact need to save this normal map externally in order to not lose it. So if I were to close out Blender right now, I would have to rebake this normal map because when I open it back up again, it would not have been saved externally. So within the image editor here, let's just do that really quick before we even get started on the ambient occlusion. So I'm going to come in here to the hamburger menu, and here it says image, and just like in Unreal, it has a little asterisk when something is not saved. So we're going to come here and choose Save As, and just choose a location that works for you on your machine and give it a name. I'm going to call this T for texture, wall, _N for normal. This is following the Unreal Engine's naming conventions here, which is just a personal preference. However, if you're working on a team, you're going to want to follow whatever naming convention is appropriate. So T for texture, wall to describe the piece, and then N for the type of map, which is normal in this case. So let's just choose save. Okay, so once you have that saved out, we are ready to move on to creating our ambient occlusion map. And I think that is going to be the last map that we bake in here before we start texture painting to get our base color and all that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this white input from 0.8 to 1. So if I zoom in on that so you can see it a little better, all I did was click in this base color, and by default it's 0.8, but I want to add a value of 1. Again, because the ambient occlusion is a black and white map, much like an alpha. Wherever the white areas are going to be fully lit, and wherever the black areas are going to be rendered as being in shadow. So it's important that you have a good basis to start off that with a value of pure white. Okay, so I'm going to press Shift and A and add a new texture, image texture. And instead of choosing from the drop down, because I have not created the texture for it, I'm just going to create the texture directly from this node. So I'm just going to hit new, and let's give it the title of ambient occlusion, which is also, of course, abbreviated as AO commonly. And I believe we do not want an alpha channel here. So let's just hit OK. And here we have our texture, and we can visualize it in the preview here by hitting the drop down and selecting our texture we just created, which of course, because we have not baked anything into it, is just a solid black. Okay, so we need to unhide our sculpt plane in order for baking to work correctly. And we need to, of course, select the sculpt plane and control and select our final render plane here, which I just have named plane at the moment. And in order for this to work, of course, we need to come into our bake settings, which again is under these render properties. And instead of baking a normal map, we're going to change this to ambient occlusion. So let's just hit bake here and see what happens. Now, it is important that when you have multiple maps going on in your material, make sure that the one you are baking into is selected in your shader node. So do not have this one selected, have this one selected. Of course, it's highlighted when it's selected, so you know easily, but let's just hit bake. And I'm going to pause again because it's probably going to take, a minute or two to bake this. Okay, so it took a minute or two to bake it, and this is my final result. Now, this is not exactly right. These black areas are indicative of some errors in my baking system here, but I did want to show you how you would go about fixing something like this. So typically when you bake maps of any kind, you want your high resolution and your low resolution mesh to be occupying the same exact physical space, because when Blender or any other program typically goes to bake, it's going to bake based on what is overlapping, and it uses the world position of these objects to determine how to bake this out. However, I have noticed in Blender specifically that I get a lot of problems with the ambient occlusion when there are areas of overlap. So if you look at these sort of black error portions of my map here, they correspond to the areas on my mesh where the sculpting plane is poking through my final render plane. So in order to fix this, all I'm going to do is I'm going to hit G on the sculpt plane and Z and pull it up ever so slightly in the Z direction. So it's hovering just, so I'm pulling it up just to the point where there are no actual mesh portions of this sculpt poking through this. So now that I have that, let's select the sculpt plane, shift select the render plane, select the ambient occlusion map, and hit bake one more time. Okay, so this was the final output bake for my ambient occlusion after I raised my plane up ever so slightly in the Z direction. And this is what the ambient occlusion for this piece should look like. So if we want to visualize this on our plane here, we're going to do this in a similar way to the normal map. Now, you'll notice when looking at all these options here that there is no dedicated ambient occlusion input for this type of material. But that's okay because ambient occlusion, there's a variety of different ways you can apply it. If you wanted to view just this map, we could just connect the color to the base color, and that would give you a pretty good idea of what it does. So if you disconnect it, you'll see that these lines and these shadows on the indented portions are just a little bit less defined. And when you connect it to the base color, it's going to render this as your base color. And you can see the definition that it adds here. So this is typically not how you would apply ambient occlusion directly, but for the purposes of just testing and visualizing to see your results, this is sufficient here. So what I would typically do to apply ambient occlusion in Blender is to have my base color node and then multiply this ambient occlusion over the top of it and put the combined result into the base color. However, this is going to eventually end up in Unreal, And Unreal's material shader nodes do have a dedicated ambient occlusion input that handles all that for you. So just a little side note on the differences between material setups here, but if you want to visualize the result of this, go ahead and just plug it into color for the time being. So the last thing we need to do here is to save our image out. So I'm just going to come to this menu, image, save as, and let's call this T wall underscore AO for ambient occlusion, and click save. Okay, so that is how we bake our maps. When we come back in the next video, we are going to start hand painting some color onto this to achieve our final result. So that is in the next video. All right, so we are back and we have just finished baking out our ambient occlusion map. So the next step to finalize this piece is really to add the color to it. So for this, I'm just going to temporarily disconnect our ambient occlusion because the color map that we want to add needs to be connected to this node. So we can't have anything else connected to it in that manner. So to add color to this, we are going to be using a process called texture painting, which is more or less exactly what it sounds like. We are going to be using the texture paint tab right here. And this will allow us to sort of dynamically just paint directly onto our mesh the colors that we want to use for our final piece. So switch over to the texture paint workspace if you have not done so already. And what we need to do, just like we did with baking, we need to add a texture to paint into for this to work properly. So this is the texture paint workspace. We have our 3D view right here in the right hand side. We have an image preview on the left hand side. And the thing that is really specific to texture paint here is all of these brush and color settings here in our properties panel. So what I need to do to start painting on this is to add a base color texture to this to paint into. And while you certainly can do it the way that we did for baking, for the purposes of texture painting, there's a much faster way. So within the texture paint tab and within texture paint mode, which if you have accidentally gone into object or to edit mode, you can quickly find the texture paint again by selecting it in the drop-down menu. We're going to come over here to the texture slots, and here we can see that we already have a slot for the normal and for the ambient occlusion because they are included in our material. So to add a texture slot for base color, all we need to do is click this plus icon and select base color. We can give it a name here. I'm just going to call it base color for now, and we can give it a size as well. We have baked all our maps at 4K, so I'm going to do the same thing here. And we can choose the sort of the starting fill color here. You can make it whatever you want. I'm just going to leave it at the default because we're going to be painting over this entire thing anyway. So we're just going to click OK. And that will bring up our new base color texture here. Now, because we are in the solid viewport shading, we are only viewing whatever texture we have selected onto our mesh. But if we want to view the whole thing as a composite the way we were before, we just need to switch back to our material preview here. And we can just ensure that our base color is connected so that it will appear correctly, which it is. If you add a base color channel via the texture paint mode, it should just connect it automatically. But if for whatever reason it does not, you can always come into your shading tab here and set it up like this just by connecting the color to the base color here. While we are here, we may as well add in our ambient occlusion the way that I mentioned in the previous video. So I'm just going to pull the base color out to give us a little bit more room. And in order for the ambient occlusion to be incorporated, obviously we need to plug it into something. So the way I would set this up for Blender is to press Shift and A, come into color, and add a mix RGB node. So this is going to take two color inputs and mix them together in whatever way you specify here. So let's connect this color to the base color just so we can see what is happening in real time as we set this up. So let's connect the ambient occlusion to color 2 and give it a second to update. Let's connect the base color to color 1. And keep in mind that this base color is still just this blank white, so we should be seeing white right here. And we're going to change the mix mode from mix to multiply. For those of you who are unfamiliar, multiply, when used in digital art, will add in the darker portions here. So anything that is darker here will be added in, and anything that is whiter, these light areas, will be ignored and will allow the base color to show through. And then we're just going to change the factor up to 1 so that this is using all of the opacity that we have available to us in the ambient occlusion map. Okay, so that is how I would set up ambient occlusion for previewing in Blender. That is optional, but I like to have it so I know what my final output is going to be like when we eventually bring this into Unreal Engine. Okay, so there's one more thing that we have to do in order to paint on this properly. Now, normally when we're painting texture maps, we can just jump in and start painting. But in this specific case, because this is a tiling piece, we want to be really careful about our edges here. So if I were to just jump in and start painting, it would paint just fine, but when I went to tile this, there would be seams, and you would notice like the strokes here would just end really abruptly. So in order to get this to tile properly with our hand painting, we're going to come into layout, and we're just going to add back in that array system I was using to preview. However, instead of using 2, I'm going to use 3. And I'll explain why in just a moment. So increase the count to 3, duplicate the modifier, and on the duplicate, set the X factor to 0 and the Y factor to 1. Okay, so what this effectively has done is tiled our mesh 3 times in each direction. And the reason I chose 3 is because now when I come in and hand paint, if I paint just the middle here, well, we have a duplicate of our mesh that is surrounded on all sides by another mesh here. So when we go in and paint on this area, it should tile seamlessly over as long as we contain our painting to the center. So let's see what that looks like in action by returning to the texture paint tab. And we're going to select our base color here. And here you can get a preview of just the base color map. You can also paint directly into it if you so choose, but I am going to be using the information from my normal map and my ambient occlusion map to better inform how I want to go about painting this. Now, whatever colors you choose are entirely up to you. You can come in here and select the color by just using this color wheel that you want to paint. So like if I wanted to paint this as sort of a blue, we could come in here and we could start painting on our mesh. And you can see now, because of the array modifier, it's going to tile seamlessly when we extend over the bounds of our original mesh. This is not the color I'm going to use. I'm going to sample my color from a reference image. So if you recall, at the top of this course, I created a reference board using a program called PureRef. Now, you don't have to use PureRef per se. This is just something I like to use. But I have all these great reference images here, and I want to be able to basically grab the colors of one of these to use in my hand painting here. So in order to do this, the image needs to be in Blender. So to get any of these images into Blender, they have to first be saved on our hard drive. Now, if you have already saved your images on your hard drive, like if you, for instance, were not using PureRef, you can skip this little part, but I'm just going to show you. So I'm going to use this image here as my color samples. I'm going to take these colors straight from the image and use them to paint on my wall here. So I like this one. I like the colors. They're saturated and they're pretty bright. And that is the overall look that I want for my walls. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to right click on this image with it selected and highlighted in blue. I'm going to hit save and export and selected images. So that's going to bring up a file browser here. You just want to select where on your PC you'd like to save it and select folder. We can give it a name. Let's call it, I don't know, wall image or something to that effect. And we can hit export here. Okay, so once we have that saved on our hard drive, we need to bring it into Blender in order to sample the colors. So I'm gonna come up here until I get the crosshairs on Blender itself, and I'm gonna drag up to split this into a new window. And for this, we are still going to keep it as an image editor, but we don't want the ability to paint on it. We just want to view. So I'm just going to select this drop down and change it to view. And that's just going to get rid of the paint options that we have up here in our top window. So I want to bring in that image I just saved. So to do that, I'm going to hit the file browser for open image. And I'm going to select it and bring it in. Okay, so this will serve as sort of a reference for me, as well as the source for my color samples. So to sample these colors, all I have to do is open the color select palette here, click on the eyedropper, come over and choose an area to sample the color from. So I'm going to try to choose something sort of mid-tone, not too dark in these shadows, not too bright in these highlights. I'm going to choose right here on the image, and that will give me this color. Now, I have this image and I can keep sampling from it as many times as I need, but if I wanted to save this color for quick use later, I could add it to my color palette. So just under the color bars here, we have an option for color palette. Now, I think, yes, by default, Blender does come with a palette with like just standard colors, but I want to save this to a new palette. So I'm just gonna hit new. You can name it whatever you want. Let's wall palette or something to that effect. So once you have the palette created, we can now start adding colors to it. And it's very straightforward. The way to add colors to your palette is have the color selected as your foreground color and just press plus, and that will add it right here automatically. This black bar represents your background color. So you can save two colors for quick reference and memory in Blender, just like you can in Photoshop or other image editing programs. And to switch between them, you just hit the X key, which is the same as it is in Photoshop. Okay, so I'm just gonna move this to the side because I'm going to paint directly onto the 3D viewport here. So I have a strength of 1. I'm gonna increase my radius a little bit because I just wanna give the entire thing a sort of base color. So I'm just gonna come in and just start painting. So it is a little bit laggy because of the tiling here. As far as I know, there's not really a way around it. You just have to be a little bit patient when it comes to making large strokes. Same with the sculpting. When you make strokes that affect a large number of vertices, it takes a little bit longer to like load that information in. Okay, so I'm keeping my painting contained to the center here to make sure it tiles properly, but I really quickly can cover this whole thing in this like beige color. So the next thing I want to do is just add a little bit of color variation over this at sort of a global scale. So I'm going to select a new color here. I'm going to select, let's say right here, and save it. You of course don't have to save these colors in order to just use them, but I like to save my colors as I go, just in case I need to get that exact color again later. So I'm just going to come in and like with a really light touch, just add a little bit of like modeling to this. Because most things in nature are not just like a single color. It looks very strange to have a single uniform color across your whole your whole piece. So that's pretty good. Let's add another layer of modeling to this. Let's grab maybe more of something a little bit more desaturated. In fact, I might just desaturate myself. So if you're familiar with Photoshop or any other image editing, you probably know what this is, but this stands for hue, saturation, and value. Hue, of course, being what color it is, saturation meaning how strong the color is, and value meaning how bright or dark it is. So I'm just going to bump the saturation down ever so slightly here. So it's a little bit more gray. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to come in and really lightly tap to sort of add some natural, it's a little bit too strong. Let's Control Z to undo that, just to add some natural color variation. And we can also turn the strength of this down to something closer to 0.5. And you can see this updating in real time over here. This is my base color image at the moment. So whenever I add a stroke, it gets added to the image over on the left-hand side of the screen. This is also a good little sanity check to have here to make sure that everything is like even. So like there's a lot of this darker color in the middle, but not so much up towards the sides here. So I just want to pay attention to that. And I've noticed that in this texture paint, at least in version 3.2 of Blender, when you paint on the 3D mesh anyway, you get these sort of like vertical lines here. This appears just to be a graphical bug because when you zoom in or out on the 2D image, those things go away. So don't worry too much if you're seeing that. As long as it's not showing up on your 3D mesh, it should be okay. Okay, so that's a pretty good jumping off point for this wall. I, of course, want to add more detail to it. So when you're hand painting textures, a general rule to follow is anything that is supposed to be pushed in away from the viewer is going to be darker, and anything that that is going to pop out is going to be lighter. And this is just true across all forms of visual art. So there's a couple of ways to do this. I am just going to hand paint it because I find the results to be overall better. So I'm going to take my darker color, which I neglected to save, but let's save it just now. I'm going to take this darker color and I'm going to just start painting in these sort of grout lines here to emphasize that these are indented in away from the viewer when you're looking at the wall. So hand painting can be a time-consuming process, but I generally find, especially when you're working with a more cartoon stylized style, like art style, that you just tend to get better results than if you do it procedurally. There's a lot you can do procedurally, but I think in this particular case, I ran some tests before recording and it just looked better when I hand painted it. So we're just gonna hand paint it. And you can see that with the tiling in effect, it really doesn't take too long. Again, how much time you want to spend and how exacting you want to get, it's entirely up to you. I'm going to keep this pretty brief because, this is just for the sake of the tutorial. If this were for a production, I would spend more time on this. So I'm coming in, I'm not being too exacting with getting it within the lines of this grout here, because I'm going to come over with a highlight and just make these edges pop out a little bit more. And I'm just using this as a reference to make sure I'm getting in all the lines that I need to. Okay, so already that makes the texture of the bricks pop a lot more than just having the base color over it. So I'm going to come in with this lighter color and I'm going to push the value up even farther. I'm going to turn the strength down though, because I want it to be slightly more subtle. And I'm going to come in and just highlight around these edges. So we have this sort of flat surface, and then there's a little bit of an edge before it goes into the grout indentation, and that's the edge I want to highlight. Okay, so I've gone around and highlighted all the edges, and I think that looks pretty good. It adds a lot more depth than the normal and the ambient occlusion map do alone. So that's a good trick, especially when working in a more cartoon style. This is a really effective way to add depth, is to just go around and highlight the edges. The last thing I want to do is, I feel like the detail that I have so painstakingly sculpted in and baked into a normal map is getting a little bit lost here. So I want to add a little bit more depth into my base color map, but only in the areas of my sculpt. So like all this surface damage, it's getting a little bit hard to see. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm basically going to do a darker wash over this, but I'm going to use my ambient occlusion as a mask to do so. So let's look at our ambient occlusion. So we have a grayscale value here, and basically right now everywhere that is white is fully lit, and everywhere that is less than white is a little bit darkened and a little bit in shadow. Now, we can use this as a mask for our color painting. So a mask, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the concept, are just these black and white images similar to alphas that we talked about when we were sculpting this piece. So just as an alpha can interpolate a black area as being no change and a white area as being full change, we can do this in painting as well as in sculpting. So let's look at how to do this in Blender. Okay, so in our texture paint panel over on the side here, we're just going to scroll down, and underneath all this color stuff is a tab called masking. So go ahead and click that drop down, and here we have either a stencil mask or a cavity mask. So we're going to use a stencil mask in this case. And if we expand these settings, we have an option here to add an image as our stencil. So we're going to click the drop down, and we're going to just select our ambient occlusion mask. So this has masked out all the areas in which we want to see the change. So I find that the black is a little bit, makes it a little hard to see what's going on. So under the display color, I'm just going to bump this up a little bit. So now if I come in here with, let's say, a darker color, and let's even make it more dark. If I come in here and paint on top of this, remembering that I'm still painting in my base color image, I'm just using the ambient occlusion as a mask. Now, I do find that when we're using stencil masks, you tend to get a little bit of a performance drop, but that is okay. You just have to be a little bit patient with it. So I'm going to increase my strength here. And what we should be seeing in this base color here is we should be seeing that all the areas that are masked out will be not painted on, they will not be affected, and the areas that are darker in the mask will be painted on. Okay, so I apologize for the performance issues. I think just because I have so many things open and I am recording, every time I make a stroke, it takes a while to load it in. So I'm probably going to pause the recording and finish this off camera, but I just want to zoom in on the image here to show you what it's doing. So with the mask that I have selected, I have gone over with a very dark color here, and this is an area under my stroke. So you'll see that all the areas that were sort of supposed to be in shadow are now being painted darker. So I'm going to pause the recording right here and just finish this up off camera because it's taking a very long time to calculate all of this information. And I don't want to waste your time with a bunch of, endless spinner loading. So I'm going to pause right here, and when we come back, this will be completely painted out. Okay, so we are back here. I have painted out some of that surface detail using my ambient occlusion map as my mask. Now, of course, I had to pause it because I was having some performance issues. So just keep in mind that when you're texture painting, Blender is always going to use your CPU and not your GPU to make these calculations. There's just no way around it. So if you're having some major like freezes or performance drops, just keep in mind that painting a smaller area will sort of help with the performance, because it's trying to calculate how many pixels per face you are painting, and it's always going to use the CPU. So if I were to try to do this whole thing, it would freeze up, and it would take several minutes to calculate that. And also, if you're not very familiar with Blender, for the most part, if you make like a stroke like that and it sort of freezes and it doesn't respond immediately, and it'll even say not responding here, just give it like a good few minutes, because all these calculations that Blender is performing are very complex. And just because it says it's not responding right here doesn't mean that you need to hard reset the program and lose your work. So I would give it a good few minutes to try to calculate that all. And, you know, if after like 10 minutes it's still not going, then maybe you do need to hard close it out through the task manager. But for the most part, I find just leaving it alone and letting it do its thing, it will eventually catch up. So how much time and detail you want to add to this is entirely up to you. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'm satisfied with this as a result. We have some highlights, we have some natural color variation, and I've gone in and added some detail back into the dark crevices and stuff. Okay, so we are done with our stencil image, so we can uncheck this to return to our actual our actual view here. We may see this sort of area repeat itself. That may be somewhat noticeable because if you look in the texture itself, this edge and this edge are somewhat darker. But for the purposes of time, I'm just going to leave it there, and I think you get the idea. So the last thing we need to do is to save this base color image, of course, so we don't lose all our work. So we're going to come into Image, Save As, and I'm going to give it the name T wall underscore BC for base color. And let's save our image. Okay, so that more or less covers the texture painting portion for this section. When we come back, we are going to look at how to finalize this mesh piece and then bring it into Unreal. So I will see you in the next video. Okay, so we have just finished up our texture painting for our wall pieces. So we need to actually get this ready to go into Unreal Engine in our game. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete these modifiers because I was just using them to make sure that the texture paint tiled appropriately. But if you look at the grid here, this wall piece is actually 12 by 12. And that's not going to fit in our scene. So let's just press X to delete these to get our 4 by 4 piece back. So we need to think about what our prototype wall pieces looked like, and we need to match this finalized piece to it essentially. So let's open up our project here in Unreal, and let's look at just one of these wall pieces here. So I'm just going to pull this out to visualize it better. So here we have a 4 by 4 surface, but it's also, I believe, 10 centimeters thick. So we want to make sure that we are either making our final piece 10 centimeters thick, or just that we know that if we replace it with a flat plane that we will not have any gaps. So I am going to make my wall pieces 10 centimeters thick because I believe that it will cause less issues when we go to replace these wall pieces. So to do that, let's go back into Blender. And remember that our grid system is exactly the same here. So essentially what we can do is tab into edit mode and look at our flat plane here. And we just need to extrude this face by 10 centimeters. So I am going to turn on grid snapping here by coming up here and pressing this icon for snap. And it is set to increment, which means that we'll be using the grid in Blender here. So I'm just going to come into the front orthographic view because remember, if you will, that our plane here for the wall is actually pointing straight up. So it's actually aligned with a floor at the moment, but we're going to fix that too. Also, if we come in here, we'll notice that our plane is not sitting on the floor exactly. If you remember when we went to bake our ambient occlusion from our sculpt plane, we had to move it up slightly. So let's clear that transform information by pressing Alt and G on our keyboard. Sorry, coming into object mode first and then pressing Alt and G on our keyboard, and that will snap it back down to the floor. So if each of these larger grid pieces is 1 meter, then each of these smaller grid pieces is going to be 10 centimeters. So we just want to extrude it up by 1. So to do that, we are going to tab back into edit mode. We're going to select the face that makes up currently the entirety of the plane. And I'm going to come into front orthographic to get a better view of what I'm doing here. And I'm just going to zoom in until these smaller grid divisions are visible. If we are zoomed out when we do this, Blender will snap to the nearest grid line that is being rendered. So it'll snap up a whole meter. Yeah. Okay, so we need to zoom out till we see at least these grid lines here. And the farther we zoom in, the more grid lines we get, obviously. But let's keep this in mind. So these larger ones are each a meter because we know it's 4 meters. So we're close enough at this point. So let's just press E to extrude and Z to make sure it's in the Z plane, and click after we reach 1 grid snap unit. I'm just going to double check that everything is oriented correctly, and I'm going to do that by coming into the overlays and turning on face orientation. Now, if you extrude it in the correct direction, your mesh should be blue. If you extruded down instead of up, your mesh will not appear in the editor correctly because your normals are reversed. So basically the interior of a mesh, if we can zoom our camera in here, every mesh is made up of individual faces, and every face has a front side and a back side. And typically only the front side will be rendered correctly because of performance reasons. That's all the computer really cares about. So if your mesh is red instead of blue, when you enable this face orientation visualization, you need to flip your normals. So to do that, although this is correct, just in case it is not for you, I want to show you how to flip your normals. To do that, you're going to tab to come into edit mode, and you're going to press A to select everything, A for all, of course. You're going to then press Alt and N to bring up the normals menu. And depending on your mesh, you can either flip it manually, which for me has now set my mesh to red, or you can hit recalculate outside, which will just look at your mesh and try to say, all right, if any faces that are pointing outwards, we want to flip the normals if they're incorrect. So it should put your whole mesh back to blue. Okay, so just now that I've verified that, I can turn off my face orientation visualization. Now, the second thing I want to look at are these edges here, because as you can see, they are not they don't project, the texture is not projected properly onto them. And that is because, of course, I painted it onto a flat face and then I gave that face some thickness. So we need to look at the UVs for these faces. Now, UVs are, to put it simply, essentially the wrapping paper that goes around your model that tells Blender or Unreal or whatever how to project the textures that we have assigned to it via our material. So because I have essentially added faces to this model after I created the texture, I just need to make sure that these sides are properly aligned to our image textures. So to do that, I'm going to come into UV editing here, which is going to pull up this workspace. It just has our model here, our 3D viewport on the right, and it has our image editor on the left. However, as opposed to being able to paint on this, if I select any faces, it will show how they are mapped to this image. So because we started with a default plane, we didn't have to do any of this before we started doing our texture. With more complex forms, you will have to UV unwrap your model before you do the texturing, but we will talk about that when we get to creating a unique prop. So the faces that are causing problems for us are just these side ones. This front face and this back face are mapped correctly, which we can see if we change over to our material preview mode. So if I select just one of these side faces here, you'll see that in the UV editor, it is represented by a single line here, which is not appropriate to the area of space it's actually taking up. So what I want to do is to unwrap just this face here. So to do that, I'm going to select just this one face. I'm going to press U while I'm hovering over the 3D side. I'm going to hit unwrap. So that is going to unwrap the face based on its area in space here. And the next thing I need to do is I need to orient it properly. So we know that this face was aligned with this edge here, but when we unwrapped it, by default, Blender tries to unwrap everything so it's aligned to the left bottom of the UV space here. So to fix this, all I have to do is select the face on the 2D on the UV side and move it around. Now note that when I move something around in here, it will not affect the position of our actual mesh. So I'm just going to select this face. I'm going to hit R and 90. Now I don't have to specify the direction or the axis here because this side is only using a two-dimensional space. So instead of using X, Y, and Z, it's really only using X and Y. However, to eliminate confusion between these different types of spaces, instead of using the letters of X and Y, we use the letters of U and V to describe this type of 2D space, just because the letters X and Y are already taken, and if you go backwards up the alphabet, U and V are next. So that is why it's called UV space. So I just want to align this now with the top here. So I'm just going to click G over in the 2D editor and align it up here. Now you can align this by eye, or you can turn on snapping for the UV editor as well, which will snap it to increments here. I'm just going to align it by eye because I often find that that is actually more exact. Okay, so now when I look at this face in our 3D viewport, you can see that these lines here, these grout lines, roughly line up with each other, which is what we want. And I mean, how exact you need to be about these side faces really depends on your prototype. If you have areas of your prototype that are displaying these faces, such as right here, you definitely want to take your time and UV unwrap them. However, if, for instance, on all the corners of my prototype that appeared like this, I had these tucked in, well, I don't need to worry about how these faces look because we will never see them. But in my case, I do see them, so I am going to UV unwrap all of these faces. So this one is aligned to the left here. I'm just going to hit U and unwrap, and because it automatically aligns newly unwrapped islands, which are what we call individual faces in the UV editor, because it automatically aligns new islands to the left side, I'm done with that side. I can just move on, and you can see it wraps perfectly around. Okay, this one is aligned to the bottom. And to better increase the accuracy of this, I am going to rotate it 90 degrees, but I want the pivot of that rotation to be based right here where this cursor is. Now, this is the 2D cursor. It looks exactly the same and functions exactly the same as the 3D cursor, but of course we are in 2D space, so it is a 2D cursor. So to change the point of rotation for this rotation operation I am about to perform, all I need to do is come up here to this icon here where we have the pivot location. Currently it's set to bounding box center. I'm just going to set it to 2D cursor so that when I press R and 90, it flips correctly here. I'm also just going to move this up so it's within the what is called the 0 to 1 UV space. Technically, whenever you unwrap something in your UVs, the image, even though you're only seeing one in the preview, it will extend indefinitely. So if I place something out here, it will look at this as a tiling image, and it will use the portion of the image that corresponds to whatever would be down here if this were infinitely tiling, which of course we can visualize by enabling the repeat image. So this is how the computer understands your image texture, but for visual clarity for our human brains, we typically only like to view the one. And this area is called 0 to 1, 0 being here. If you're thinking about this as a graph coordinate system, this would be 0, 0, this would be 1, 1. So anything contained within this square is going to be referred to as 0 to 1 UV space. So I just want, it doesn't necessarily need to be in here. It's just a good habit, and press G and Y to move it upwards so that it is properly aligned within our 0 to 1 UV space. And it does look like I maybe moved it a little bit accidentally, so I'm just going to align this corner. I'm just going to eyeball it. And here we see our grout lines are properly aligned. Okay, last one. This one's on the right. You unwrap, and I don't need to rotate this or anything. I just need to press G and X to move it along the X axis here. And we can zoom in and get as exact as we like. Okay, so we are almost ready to bring this into Unreal Engine. However, if we brought it in right now, we would not be able to replace our wall meshes properly. Firstly, because this is aligned as a floor currently, so it needs to be rotated by 90 degrees. So to do that, all we have to do is select it in object mode and press RX90, and that will align it as a wall piece. However, you'll see that the pivot point for this mesh is directly in the center of the mesh, which is not going to work for our purposes. We need it to be at the bottom, because if we go back into Unreal and look at our piece here, we can see that the pivot point is at the front bottom of the mesh. Now this is really important. Whenever you're going to make your final mesh assets to replace your block mesh here, the pivot point needs to be exactly the same relative to these mesh pieces. Otherwise, when you go to replace it, everything will be in the wrong place, and you will basically have to go in and rebuild this by hand, which was something we were trying to avoid. So let's place our pivot point right here on this mesh. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to press 1 to come into front orthographic, and I'm going to press tab to come into edit mode. And now if I press A to select everything here, now when I move this mesh, its pivot point will stay exactly where it is in world space, and I can just move the mesh relative to it. So if I were to move this in object mode, let me turn that off so it's a little bit more clear, you can see that the pivot is moving with it. However, if I tab into edit mode and move it now, you can see that the pivot stays where it is. So I'm just going to move the mesh relative to its pivot to match this orientation here. So let's take care of that right now. So I'm going to come into 1, I'm going to re-enable snapping, and so I know that it's going to snap properly to the grid. I'm just going to press A to make sure I have everything selected. I'm going to press G and Z and snap it up until the bottom is at the bottom here. The pivot is at the bottom of the mesh, and then I'm going to press G and X and move it this way. Now, the other thing to notice here about this pivot is that it is snapped to this front corner of our mesh here. So we just want to make sure that our pivot on our Blender mesh is at a corner, not in between these two. So it appears to be at the back corner here. So let's just come into the right orthographic. Let's press G and Y and move the mesh back. So now we have our mesh snapped perfectly to this corner. Okay, so in order for any of these changes to take effect, we need to make sure that the transforms are zeroed out. So what I mean by that is we need to apply the changes that we've made to the rotation and the location, because if we come in here, we can see here that the scale is at 2 and the rotation's at 90. Basically, we want these all to be 0 and these all to be 1 in order for these to convert properly to Unreal Engine. So I'm just going to apply the transforms here. So I'm going to select my mesh in the in the 3D viewport. I'm going to hit Control and A to bring up the Apply menu, and I'm just going to hit All Transforms. So nothing has changed about our mesh, but all these numbers have been zeroed out. So we're basically saying this is the basic dimension for this mesh. If you remember, this is analogous to baking our rotation and scale when we were generating our prototype meshes. So that is essentially just what we have done here. Okay, so the last step we need to take is to export this into a type of file that Unreal can bring in. So if you recall, a Blender file is saved always as a .blend. And Unreal cannot read this file type by default. So let's export this into an FBX. So to export this, we're going to hit File, Export. Make sure that you have this mesh selected in your viewport when you do this. File, Export, and we're going to choose the FBX type. We're going to navigate to an area on your computer where you want to save this FBX file. And we're going to give it a name. Let's call this SM wall 4 meters. Again, I'm following the Unreal Engine naming conventions here. SM prefix for static mesh, the type it is, and then because if you were to have different types of walls, like if you had a 2-meter wall or a corner wall, I like to further specify the type of wall that it is. So what we need to do here before we hit export is just limit to selected objects. Everything else should be fine to leave at default for this type of mesh. So make a note of where you are saving this to, because you're going to need to know that when you bring it in, and just hit Export FBX. Okay. Once you have this exported, we're going to jump back over to Unreal. Okay. So we've talked about how to import assets before with these audio assets and things like that. And relatively, the process is going to be largely the same here. So I'm just going to first create a new folder. I have my generated mesh folder right here for all my prototypes, but I would like to save my final art assets in a different folder. So I'm just going to right click, press new folder. I'm just going to call this one mesh. Okay, let's double click to open that. And I'm going to import the file I just created. So you can either find it in your file browser, wherever you saved it. You can either find it and bring it in directly from here. I could drag it, or you can also hit this import button right here, which will bring up a file browser. You want to navigate to where you saved it, SMWall 4 meters, and click open. Now it's going to give you this pop-up for your import options. Most of these can be left at default. However, I do want to change some things in the material here. Because we have a material applied to this, Unreal is going to try to bring it in and try to import the material with it, which sounds like something that we would want, but I actually find I get cleaner results if I just change the search location to do not search and the material import method to do not create material, because we're going to create it ourselves by hand. We're also going to uncheck this import textures. I'm going to bring the textures in myself. So we're just going to hit import, new smoothing group. Don't worry about that error. It shouldn't affect us at all. So basically what we've been imported now is just this plain wall piece here. If we gave it our grid material at this point, it would look exactly the same as our prototype wall. The reason why I brought in a new piece versus just replacing the textures on our prototype wall is because the UVs for this are not set up correctly to handle the textures we created for this. So that is why I went to all the trouble of creating a separate mesh, is because I needed the UVs to work properly. So let's go ahead and remove that. And I'm also going to create a new folder under my content here. And I'm going to call this one textures. And now we're just going to bring in the image textures that we created in Blender. So let's hit import, and we're going to bring in the AO, the BC, and the N. You'll get this little thing here that T while N was imported as a normal map, which is what we want. Just click OK. Unreal has an amazing magical way of just knowing when something is a normal map. Okay, so let's hit save all to save these in here. So we cannot apply these textures directly to the mesh. We first need to set up a material. Now, we're a little bit familiar with materials because we were duplicating materials to create our prototype grids. However, we're going to set up a new material from scratch here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to pause the recording, and when we come back, we'll look at how to create a new material for this piece. Okay, so here we are in Unreal. We've brought in our custom mesh piece with the proper UVs and everything. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna learn how to create a material setup for this to properly handle our texture inputs. So first thing I'm gonna do is create a new folder, of course, for materials. All right, within this folder, I'm going to right click in the content browser and just create a new material. Let's give it a name. Let's just call it wall for now. We're probably going to change the overall setup, but for this point, let's just call it wall. Okay, double click to open that material. And here we have our material editor. So we have an output node here, a preview, and some properties. And this should be somewhat familiar because it's pretty analogous. We have a preview, we have some material properties, and we have our node editor here, just as we do in Unreal. So here we have some familiar inputs like base color and metallic. We also have a dedicated ambient occlusion here. So setting up a material in Blender, as long as you have the textures for it, it's extremely simple. Let me just dock this somewhere. Oops. Okay. So I'm going to come over to my textures tab in my content browser, and let's start with the base color here. I'm just going to click and drag this in to get the base color node. So all I have to do to get this to display is connect RGB to base color, and your preview will update here. Now by default, your material preview will always be a sphere. There's some options if you wanted to visualize this on other shapes. Let's put ours on a cube to, because that's closer to our final mesh piece here. So we can also specify a specific static mesh here by using this one. However, we just have to have the mesh selected, highlighted in our content browser. So if I picked my wall piece here and clicked this static mesh, well, now we can see the preview on the actual mesh piece it's going to go on. So that's great. Let's leave it there. Okay, so now we just need to connect the other two in a similar way. Let's bring in the N, the normal, and Unreal, you don't need any special in-between nodes. You can just connect normal to normal, and you can see the results right there. The last one is the AO, and we're just going to connect this one to this one. Simple enough. Now, if you feel like you want some roughness variation, you can definitely do that as well. You can create a roughness map in the texture paint of Blender here. You know, if I were to come in back into my texture paint and I can add roughness. Now, roughness works largely the same way ambient occlusion does, in that it is a grayscale image. 1 will be a value of fully rough, and 0 will be a value of fully smooth. But these things can be represented numerically as well. So if I were to, say, come into Unreal here, I'm just going to press 1 on the keyboard to add, and click to add a new single-digit floating point value. So by default it's 0. If I connected this to roughness, you would see we have a perfectly smooth, like shiny mesh here, which you can see better at a glancing angle. And if I were to change this to 1, we would have a perfectly rough map right here. So you can give it a solid value, and by default, if you have nothing connected, I believe the default is like 0.5 or something. But the thing is that it will be the uniform roughness across the whole surface. So you can either come in and create a roughness map in exactly the same way I showed you how to create the other maps, but I am going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to use my ambient occlusion to sort of generate a roughness map. So the ambient occlusion texture has white values for the flat surfaces and black values for the indentations. So if we remember that white is for our roughness map is fully rough and black is fully smooth, we actually kind of want the opposite of this for our roughness, because we want the flatter areas to be smoother than these indentations and these damage points. So to flip the color of a grayscale image here, I'm going to drag off this node and I'm going to type in 1 minus. And then if you want to preview what any individual node looks like, all we have to do is right click on this and start preview. So this is what our inverted ambient occlusion map looks like. So if I were to plug this into roughness and stop previewing it, this would be the result. It's not exactly what we want because it's obviously far too dark, the map itself, which means that our roughness is far too smooth. But the important thing to note here is that I now have a variable roughness. So certain areas are rougher than others. So to get this to work properly, we just need to do a little bit of math in these nodes here. And what I'm going to do is instead of using this map directly, I am going to use this map to interpret between two roughness values that I set. I'm going to do that using what is called a linear interpolation. So if we just come into the graph, hold L on the keyboard and click, that will add a linear interpolation or a LERP node. So this works in a very similar way to our mix RGB node here. This basically is interpolating the two inputs and giving you a single output. So we have color 1 input, color 2 input, and a factor. Now this is the same thing here. We have A is basically our color 1 input, B is our color 2, and alpha is our factor. Now we just slid the factor all the way up to 1 in Blender, but if we instead use this as our factor, basically anything that is black will be given whatever value we assign to A, and anything that is white will be given whatever value we assign to B. So if I were to come in this node and change these defaults here, well, actually, let's just leave it. Let's leave A is 0 and B is 1 and just see what it looks like when we plug it into our roughness. And let's also stop previewing so we can see this. So here we get a very similar result in that we have a very smooth, we have a variation between very smooth and very rough. So if I wanted this to be rougher, less shiny, all I needed to do is to up this A value to something higher. Let's try 0.5. All right, and there we go. It's a very subtle difference, but especially when you view your meshes at more of a glancing angle, it does make a lot of difference on the overall effect that these meshes have. So let me try to position my camera in such a way that you'll see it. So if I were to disconnect this roughness value, the roughness is just sort of uniform over the whole thing. And it's fine because we have enough information going on with the AO and the normal and stuff. But doing this just adds a little bit more variation into it. So, you know, this is optional. If you don't care for doing this, don't worry about it. You can leave the roughness at its default, but I like to just add a little bit more detail in here. Okay, so we have set up our material here. So now we just need to apply it to our mesh. Let's click save here to make sure that we save our material. And we can click out of this. So all we need to do now is apply this as our default material to our new mesh, which I can just do by dragging. So there we go. We have our completed wall piece. However, we haven't actually placed it anywhere in our level yet. So the reason that we spent the time to do the prototypes is because when we go to replace it now, we can do this essentially in one click. So I'm going to go into the room 1 of our level to show you how to do this. Okay, so we're in room 1 here, and we have all these wall pieces. So I could go in here and select them all manually, but it's much faster because we were so organized up at the top of this to come into our room 1 and select all of our wall pieces here. Unfortunately, they're named box in room 1 because I wasn't too organized, but that's okay. So I'm just going to select everything that is a box here. And with all of these selected, I can just right click, replace selected actors with, and if I have this selected, it will be the first thing here. So I can just hit replace selected actors with our static wall mesh. Well, first of all, we have a problem here, and that is because our rotation on our static mesh piece is incorrect. So this is what I mean about being careful about pivot points. If your pivot point is not set up to match that of your prototype, your pieces will align incorrectly. So before we panic here and start having to move everything over, it looks to me like our pivots are just off by a rotation value of 90 degrees, which is very easily fixed. So let's come back into Blender. And in this layout here, all I have to do is rotate this along the Z axis by 90 degrees. So I just typed RZ90, and I'm just gonna press Control A and apply the rotation. With this selected, export, FBX, I'm gonna select the file to overwrite it and make sure that this still has selected objects only. I'm just gonna hit export, and I'm gonna come into Unreal, and I'm gonna right click on the mesh in the content browser, and I'm gonna hit re-import. So it has updated the rotation and everything is all good there. So this is really exciting because now we can come into any room here, every room here. We're gonna do it for all the rooms. Room 2, I'm gonna select all these wall pieces in my outliner here. I'm gonna right click, replace selected actors with my wall piece. And there we go. Collapse that, collapse my ceiling, come into room 3, we have all our floors. Okay, here are our walls. Lots of them. I'm going to shift select to do them all, right click, replace with my wall. Give it a minute to think about it. Obviously, the more you try to replace in a single maneuver, the longer it's going to take to load them all. But look at that. That totally changes the entire feel of our game here. Even with these still as our prototype meshes, this is great. And you can see we can so easily, just by spending a few hours creating a single piece, we are able to change aesthetically 99% of our game here. I'm gonna do this for all of these rooms. And my last one here. Great. All right, let's hit save all, make sure that we save all these changes to our mesh and our level. And if we hit play, oops, I forgot to move my player start back to the actual start. I'm just gonna fly back there and put my player start back where I want it to actually begin. So now if we run through this, I mean, of course, we still have a lot of prototype grid bright color pieces, but look how much just creating that single piece has changed the entire feel of our game. So I'm going to wrap up this video here. I'm going to do one more quick one on how to basically use this same texture for the floors and the ceilings, but that's going to be a really quick video. So I will see you when we return. Okay, I just wanted to do one last quick video before we move on to prop creation, and I want to just take a minute to talk about how we can reuse this piece essentially to create the floors and the ceilings as well. So if you wanted to create unique floors with a different texture, by all means go for it, but I am just going to reuse this texture here because I can, essentially. I created a texture that tiles in all 4 directions, and because it's just basically stone blocks, there's no reason, I don't think, why I can't use this for my floors and my ceilings as well. Now, the argument for not using it is that things become very monochromatic here, and you would definitely want to break up the texture in some way, either by adding more props or by, again, creating a unique and different texture for the floor. But I just want to show you how once you create one really solid piece, creating the other versions of it is a lot quicker. So let's pop back into Blender. I just have my wall tile piece here. I'm just going to hit G and X. Actually, I'm going to hit G and Y, and I'm just going to move it over to the side. So all I have to do to make this functional for a floor piece is duplicate this mesh by pressing Shift and D and duplicating it. Click anywhere. I'm going to press Alt-G to snap it back to the center of the world. And I just need to rotate this in the X direction by 90 degrees. I'm sorry, I need to rotate it in the Y direction, of course, by 90 degrees because we have flipped our orientation based on our pivots here. And let's just double check the pivot of our floor pieces here. Okay, so it's in the bottom corner. So we just want to match that in Blender here. So it is also in the bottom corner here. So I think for the purposes of this, it should be ready to go. Now, if we have this flipped to the wrong quadrant, we might get some errors, but let's just, let's apply these rotations and let's see how they look. And if we need to make further adjustments, we've already seen how quick those kinds of adjustments can be. I'm also just going to name these because now that I have more than one, I don't want to get confused. Okay, I have my wall here, and then this one I'm going to name SM floor 4 meters. Okay, so before we export this, let's just apply the rotation by selecting it, pressing Control and A, and applying the rotation so that it's zeroed out. Let's hit File with just the floor selected, File, Export, FBX. Now, if you haven't exited out of your Blender since doing the wall, these settings should be the same. So again, the only real setting we need to change is to make sure that we have selected objects selected. Otherwise, it will export everything in your scene as a single object. So we would be getting even this high resolution sculpt plane and the wall and everything else with it, which we don't want. We just want the selected object. Of course, we don't want to overwrite our wall file. So let's just change the name to floor. The red highlight will go away, meaning that we are no longer overwriting an existing file. Let's hit Export and come into Unreal here. Open our mesh folder, import. Let's import our floor. Again, your settings should remain the same from your last import, but just make sure that we're not importing textures and we're not creating material because we're going to reuse the ones we already made, so we don't want to import a bunch of duplicates. Ignore that for now. Okay, so same thing here. Because we are using all the same settings and all the same UV space, we can just drag this wall material that we already made directly into our mesh, and we don't even have to mess with the settings at all. So let's try this out. I'm going to try it with the 1 to make sure that the pivot is correct. I'm just going to replace my selected actors with the floor. Okay, so it does look like we need to rotate this around the Z by about 90 degrees, but that's no problem at all. Let's just do that in Blender. So let's just hit R, Z, 90, and I believe we want to flip it in the negative direction, so let's hit minus after doing all that before we click. I believe this will be the correct orientation. Apply the rotation, export, FBX, overwrite our floor file. So as long as you're overwriting the same files in your file browser on your hard drive, you can just re-import, and it will look at that file location and bring in whatever you have changed. All right, so that is correct. So now we can go about doing that with our floors. So let's start in room 1. Let's put our camera in it so we can see what happens. We don't need the ceiling. We just want the floor. And there you have it. So you can go ahead and continue to do this for your whole level. With regards to the ceiling, we are using basically the exact same mesh here. So if you want to replace it with the same mesh, you can. However, if you did decide you wanted to come in and have like a different texture or something applied to your floor piece, if you made that change to your floor and you used a duplicate floor for the ceilings, you would have to have the same textures for both of these by default, or you would have to come in and manually change the textures on all the ceilings. So largely it's up to you. It's technically slightly more performant to have these pieces be an instance of the same mesh, but I find for just ease of like workflow, I find it better to have all them have separate mesh references in memory here. So I think what I can do here is I'm just going to duplicate, just move this over. I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to put it back towards the center of the world here to ensure I have a correct pivot. And I'm just going to export this as a new piece called ceiling. Again, this is largely a matter of personal preference. I find that my workflow is better when I have just separate mesh pieces for the different types of mesh there are, regardless of whether or not they're duplicates. So same thing with these ceilings here. Let's come into room 1. Make sure we have our ceiling selected. Replace with ceiling. And everything should be exactly the same. So the last little bit of mesh that could potentially reuse this texture is these columns. So the way that I would go about making this, let me check the dimensions here. So I think the columns are 0.5, like 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters by 400. So you could basically reuse this texture on the columns as well. That might not be the best visual design, but you could do it. The way that I would reuse this type of texture for the columns, let me just move these over. I would come into Blender, I would add a new cube, I would give it the dimensions of my my prototype column, so I think it's like 0.5 by 0.5 by 4. I would give it the same pivot, of course, which is the bottom center, it looks like. So for this one, all you would really have to do, sorry, just moving these over. All you would really have to do is tab into edit mode, select everything with A, move it up until the bottom is at the pivot point. The last thing you'd have to do is you would have to UV unwrap this properly, but we already have like all of our info in it. So at this point, if I were to give it the material we made, it would look like this. And this is also how it would look in our game, because it's using the UVs that we set up, right? So the way that I would do this quickly is well, first we got to apply the scale. If you ever see something like this happen where you select a face here and you unwrap it and the proportions of the face are incorrect, it's because we have not applied our scale. So if I press N to bring up the side panel, you can see our scale here is at like 0.25. So we're just going to apply it the same way that we applied our other transform information. So I'm going to hit Control A, going to apply the scale. So now if I select this face and press U and unwrap, it should scale appropriately. And those ones look okay. So here is just about lining them up so that they wrap appropriately according to, you know, how you would like that to look. But essentially this is a workable column, right? So, you know, make sure all your transforms are zeroed out. That looks good. Export it in the same way. Give it a unique name. Export within here. Let's close that out. Come into our mesh folder. Import our column. Don't create a material for it. Ignore the warning. And come in here for this. Okay, so I know I flew through those last few, but it really is exactly the same process as you would do for like the wall and the floor and the ceiling and the column all have the exact same process. So I went through that really fast, but I just wanted to show you how you can very quickly change your level from this prototype stuff to something with finalized pieces. Now, whether or not you want to use the exact same texture for the wall and the floor and the ceiling and the columns, I mean, that's up to you. Probably not, not without more props and visual breakup to that, because otherwise it's just going to be one sort of monotone color here. But you can get working textures in here really fast, and I just want to show you how powerful tiling textures can be for pieces like this. So that is going to wrap up our section on creating our tile sets here, and you can go in and replace all of these grid pieces in exactly the same way that we did for the walls here. So I'm gonna just go ahead and do that off camera because I don't think you need to see it again and again. But that's gonna wrap up our tiling, our tile set portion of the course. And next up, we are going to look at how to create some more unique looking props and replace some of these blocks and things like that. So I will see you in the next section.